Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's debate between Mark and Evan. I am Mark, Evan is my co host, and today we're going to be doing a debate on a topic that a lot of people used to talk about all the time. Nowadays, you don't really hear it as much, and we might get into that as to why that's the case in this debate. But today we're going to be talking and going over the motion that is, should we still dream the American dream? Especially in 2026. What does the American dream mean? Does it apply to us? Is it even achievable? Should we even dream it? And so that's what we're going to be discussing today. Evan is for the motion. I am opposed to the motion. And so I will let Evan get the opening statement, his first opening statement.
All right, Mark, thank you so much. I've really been enjoying doing these. For those of you who don't know me or haven't seen me yet, my name is Evan Lucy. I'm a board member for Amending America. Mark and I have known each other for years. And just as a brief disclaimer, I think we could both, at any given time, give compelling arguments on either end of the motion. This is primarily for us to provoke a meaningful discussion about the American dream and what it means and how we can participate optimally in American society and how the American dream, whatever it is, fits within our American identities. So with that out of the way, the American dream is inherently a kind of ambiguous relative thing. So I want to spend the first maybe minute of my opening statement giving, I guess, some scaffolding or a framework so that we can have the best debate that we can rather than quibbling back and forth on definitions. So for the sake of being able to go over something specific, I'm going to say that the American dream is four things, or three and a half things. One is owning a home. Two is getting married and having children, in that order. Three is being financially better off than your parents. And then four, you could argue about whether or not this is just a constitutional right as opposed to the American dream per se. But I'm also saying that the American dream also constitutes equal opportunity and freedom to speak, freedom to travel, freedom to worship, and freedom to associate. So with me speaking for the affirmative, my, I guess, position and my obligation for this debate is I'm going to argue that the American dream is something that is still achievable, even in 2026, that it's a worthy aspiration to have, and it's one that we should continue to have. So for my first argument, I would still say, even now, that the American dream is entirely plausible within the framework that I've provided. And the reason why I say that is even with this fairly specific definition for what the American dream is, there's still a lot of flexibility within the, I guess, criterion that I've listed. And as a matter of fact, the exact particulars of the American dream, even with owning a home, getting married, having kids, being better off than your dad or your granddad or your mother or your grandmother, those can and should be very flexible generation to generation, or even decade to decade as geopolitical events go as they go. Owning a home, that aspect of the American dream, it does not specify size or price or financing or when you should own a home, like 18, 25, 30. That's not specified. And I think we can also talk within a very wide area of variance when it comes to getting married and having kids. I don't think there should be a rote hard number through the ages for when or how many kids to have. And then as well, being financially better off than your parents, I would say that is a achievable and worthy aspiration, just as a matter of common sense. And you might argue, well, as your parents attain wealth or get to what would be considered the median for an American quality of life, and it's necessarily going to be harder for future generations to get quote unquote wealthier. And I'd say that's true to an extent, but also it's so much easier to build wealth when you have wealth. And even if your parents are rich, I guess, I mean, if anything, at that point, it would be so much easier for you being born into wealth to place that wealth into a business or a high yield savings account or a mutual fund, or especially in the white collar sector, even in the blue collar sector, it's not uncommon for employers to have 401ks with a 401k match. So building wealth is going to get easier and harder for factors that are completely outside of our control, time period to time period. But it's not like it's impossible to do that, or even unrealistic. And as a cap to that first argument, I also do want to point out that we are debating over whether or not the American dream, as defined, is a worthy aspiration, not what Americans are obligated to do per se. So we're not talking about 100% of Americans have to have accomplished all of these things for the purposes of the American dream. We're not talking about that. It's more so what should Americans want, or what is a healthy thing for an American to want. So that's my first argument. So my second argument is that the American dream, as I defined it, or as it currently exists, continuing to have that specific dream defends public and private freedoms that allow society to flourish. This argument, it's at risk of being circular. It can be a chicken and egg thing. Well, is the American dream good because we think we should have it, or should we have it because we think it's good? What I'm essentially saying is that by preserving the American dream, that implies that those things are things that we realistically can have and should have. And if we're in an ebb or a flow within American history where one of those things is in danger, then if anything, we should want that more or desire it more. So if we're looking at, for example, for the purposes of home ownership, if something like, I don't know, a monolithic private equity firm is suddenly buying up thousands upon thousands upon thousands of family homes, and therefore they are able to control the pricing of those homes and make it more difficult for Americans to own them. I don't think the healthy response there should be, well, we should dream something else. I think the response should be, okay, American society has flourished on the basis that people have aspired to own homes. And if this thing is being more controlled, or if it's at risk of being taken away, then it's something that we should not budge on and fight through the civil processes that we were given during the founding to preserve those things. I would say that, like I mentioned in my first argument, the particulars, the numbers for the American dream can change, but having those aspirations, that makes it so that all of those things continue to get more achievable through the desires that Americans have towards that dream being lived out in the American process, I guess, is what I'm getting at. And then my final argument, which is pertaining to the consequence that I mentioned just now. Whereas I mentioned that my role in this debate is to defend and uphold the American dream as it exists and show why it's a worthy thing to aspire to. To an extent, Mark's position and his obligation within the debate is to show why that's not either needed, or why it's not necessary, or even potentially why the American dream as it exists might be harmful or limiting in some way. And I'm sure that he's going to give some very compelling argumentation to that end. But my third argument is to surrender or even fundamentally change the American dream means that one or more of the things that I listed at the beginning are in greater danger, or it's easier for them to be deprived from people. Uh, to an extent, that's simply an offshoot from my second argument, but essentially, like I mentioned before, if elements of the American dream get harder or less achievable or not immediately urgent, or it's not immediately understood why they're so important, I don't think the best or most appropriate response is, okay, well, let's just stop wanting those things then, because the path of least resistance is to desire something else, or worse yet, settle for less, which I think is what you always have to run the risk of if we're talking in the terms of should the American dream be changed or surrendered in any way. And that's my opening statement. Mark, take it away.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, should the American dream still be dreamt today? We can just use your definition, the 3 points, 3.5 points of the American dream, and I don't think that it's really achievable for most Americans nowadays, especially how it was achieved in the past, especially for the greatest generation coming out of World War II. They were still in their 20s and early 30s, and they were able to get amazing jobs. They were able to get a home, get married, be responsible for the baby boom, and have cars and all the things, all the amenities that come with the American dream, along with a newfound growth of freedoms, since freedom is one of your criteria of the American dream. There were greater freedoms that came out post World War II in America. You had this economic boom as well, and we don't really see that economic boom anymore. A lot of what we have nowadays is just debt and speculation rather than actual industrious growth. We're not like producing as much relative to the total population, and so the total population cannot get that wealth, and also wealth is being funneled. I know you and I can debate the ethics of modern day capitalism in another debate, but it is a fact that back in the 40s and 50s, wealth was more spread out. As Huey Long would have said, the wealth was shared among the people more so than it is today, and that had a great equalizer, at least economically, in this country, which meant that more people could pursue the American dream. We don't have that equal status, more of an equal status, as that existed back then as we do today. And so some people are experiencing an American dream that's far more luxurious and more free, economically free, and even socially free than many Americans today. And I think that having that difference, that inequality in the American dream, in realizing the American dream, is going to have a negative effect on this country, because that builds discontent between the classes, and that discontent will lead to more radicalization of the lower classes, more class consciousness, more revolt against the system in more and more aggressive ways, as fewer and fewer people, relative to the total population, are experiencing the American dream, while more and more people are being shunned out from the American dream. So my main argument is a pragmatic approach of class consciousness and class warfare, and how having this economic expectation, which the American dream is mostly an economic expectation, you have some freedoms which are not necessarily economic. You have some social parts of the American dream, like starting a family. But starting a family is very economic. You cannot start a family with a minimum wage anymore, unless there are some conditions, like you get welfare checks or you're in a very impoverished community. The American dream itself, I mean, you can have children, obviously, just biologically, but that doesn't mean that they're going to grow up with the amenities that the American dream calls for. So you can still be married, you can still have children, all that, but not within the same expectations of the standard of living that the American dream usually conjures up when people think of the American dream. So the American dream is mostly an economic expectation versus the economic reality, and the economic reality is just not there for most Americans today. And if we look back historically, the American dream was not really applied to a lot of people back then in the 40s and 50s post World War II. Black people, for example, especially in the South, were still living in Jim Crow conditions. They were barred from certain neighborhoods, they were barred from businesses, they were barred from schools, they were not given the same economic or social freedoms as their fellow whites. And so they were not experiencing the American dream. In fact, there was a debate between uh, William Buckley and I forget a civil rights leader. William Buckley is the founder of the National Review, and James Baldwin. That's the civil rights leader's name. And they were debating this very topic, but as it pertains to the black community. And this was a debate that happened in the 60s. And I watched it in preparation for this debate. And I agree with Baldwin, James Baldwin, that the American dream was not only being applied to black Americans, it was at the expense of black Americans. That was the motion of the debate. Is the American dream at the expense of the American Negro? That's the name. That's the official motion. And it was debated in Oxford Union. I don't know why it was debated there, between two Americans. But, listening to James Baldwin explain his experience growing up as not only a black man, but as a gay black man in the 40s and 50s and going into the 60s, relative to William Buckley, who was more privileged, economically speaking, of a higher class, economic class, who was arguing in favor of the American dream. And this is why we need to, do history and look at people of the past, listen to their words and ideas and what they are experiencing. Because although there was a disconnect between Baldwin and Buckley, we can learn from both of their perspectives. And the perspective that I'm formulating in this debate is one where I do not see the American dream, as it's stipulated, as being achievable for not just most Americans, but for even just the average American, or even just very, very few Americans can actually achieve it. And so it shouldn't be an expectation or a dream that we should have if it's not achievable, right? The whole point of the American dream is that it's actually achievable. Just because it has the word dream in it doesn't mean it's not achievable. Well, nowadays it is not achievable, so it is just a dream for us. But back then, when the American dream was, the term was being used, it wasn't just a offhand remark about aspirations that no one's ever going to to acquire. No, it was actually something that a lot of people back then were doing. A lot of people back then were not doing it as well. And that was the debate between Baldwin and Buckley. But again, for today, I do not see this dream as being healthy for our psyche when it comes to how we look at America, what we expect from America. We expect certain living conditions, certain standard of living, certain economic liberties, as well as social ones. And until we fix the economic issues, I simply don't think that we should be promoting the American dream as much. Maybe as like an aspiration for a political movement to have more economic equality, to widen the target audience of Americans who will not just have this dream, but also achieve this dream. I can see that, restoring the American dream as being part of a political movement to do that. But if that's not being used in that context, I don't think that we should be dreaming the American dream until those economic and social, I guess, conditions change. I've mostly just talked about the economic conditions. Let me talk about the social ones as well. And socially, a lot of things have changed since the 40s in America. When it comes to women's liberation, when it comes to the proliferation of same-sex relations or other not not really at that time recognized social movements or respected social movements that are respected now that contradict the American dream. Like if you're in a heterosexual or a homosexual relationship and you don't plan on adopting, then you can't have children. So that takes off a part of the American dream. Or if you live in a polyamorous situationship or whatever they're called, you obviously can't get married to more than one person. That's just law. And so the American dream can't apply to them because they can't marry multiple people that they want to. So that's a social limitation based on our laws. And I'm not arguing in favor of polygamy. I'm just saying that we don't have as much freedom. There are limitations to what we can do. I'm not saying that that's good or bad. I'm not a Mormon. But these limitations to our freedoms, to the things that we can physically do, is contradictory to the American dream. Back then, in the 40s, you did have a growth in what you can do, a movement for expanding what you can physically do that is legally allowed. But nowadays, we've kind of reached a point where there's not really any more room to grow. I guess polygamy might be one of them, where we can still have some social change. Again, I'm not advocating for that, but that's just room for social change. And, we've kind of, because we've progressed, and I use that term in the sense of we've changed so much socially, I'm not sure if we can really handle any more change right now. I think things need to stabilize, calm down, get into a routine, and then using reason, we can work out what other changes need to be done. And this goes back to my economic argument, which is, not disrupting or antagonizing the working class by propagandizing this expectation, this economic expectation that isn't achievable, which will bring about discontent. When you promise someone something and then you don't give it to them, that's worse than if you didn't promise them anything in the first place. And so this dream is a promise. It's the American promise. I think that was a slogan used by Reagan during his first campaign running for president. in 1980. I think, yeah, it was The American Promise, where he was talking about the American dream. And his approach was more, stabilizing things and focusing on families and home ownership, which again at that time was achievable. By the 80s, that's the boomer generation starting to be homeowners because they're now in their 30s and 40s. And if you look at today, it's like the youngest average homeowner is like in their 50s or 60s nowadays, late 40s maybe, not 20s or 30s. And this doesn't even take into consideration the size of the home. This includes small homes. People, homes that you can't have a family in. So you might be able to buy a home, but you can't have a family. You might be able to have a family, but you can't buy a home. You might be able to have one car, but it needs to be on credit. You have to do like all these things separately. The American Dream puts them all together, but the price is just too damn high nowadays to do all those things within your lifetime for the average American nowadays. And so I'm concerned with the expectation, with the disappointment that expecting the American dream and not achieving the American dream will cause. And that's my main argument.
All right, Mark. Well, thank you very much. And now we're going to move into rebuttal. So I'm going to go point by point, more or less. One is, this was an overarching point that you mentioned throughout, but just essentially that the math isn't mathing on the American dream, that the economic realities for the American dream to be realized in the way that you and I are probably imagining it, like the post-war white picket fence, guy goes to work in his suit and briefcase, they own a car, et cetera, et cetera. That's just not there. And that's a fair thing to say. And I think we absolutely should be talking, many more people should be talking about the fact that things like families, ownership, not even ownership of a home, ownership in general, as opposed to needing to rent and license everything, the whole you will own nothing and be happy thing, that's changed, and that's not necessarily a good change from then to now. But that just brings me back to the first argument that I made, where that doesn't, we can talk about that without saying, well, owning a home is just kind of out of the bag, then we should probably just forget about that. Even within the current landscape, I mean, if you discharge honorably from the United States Armed Forces, you can buy a home with 0% down. Now, would it be more ideal for you to just be able to enjoy a high enough quality of life and for the class inequality to not be so bad that you could just buy the home either through more reasonable financing or just outright with cash? Yeah, it would be way more ideal. But are those things possible without financially ruining yourself? I would say that yes, they still are, even though it absolutely is harder, even though it absolutely is more gatekept than it was before. But that doesn't necessarily negate the American dream, principally speaking. So the next argument that I want to address was essentially you saying that if we continue to maintain and desire the American dream, and if that is habitually deprived, or even if American society in general just continues to gain this awareness that at one point we had this American dream and it's being held hostage by other interests or or some other group, like, take your pick, private equity, the global elites, the 1%, the this, the that, whoever that party might be, that if greater, with enough class awareness, with enough built up resentment, predicated on expecting the American dream, that's going to lead to factional violence. And I would say that, for hopefully obvious reasons to anyone watching, that preventing factional violence is good. We should desire that. However, if you talk to a founding father like Thomas Jefferson, and you said, well, if people are being denied the American dream, that's going to result in violence, he would probably go, good. He would probably not be all that upset by something like that. And I would say that might be a debate topic in and of itself, talking about the inevitability or the necessity of violence in order to achieve political reform. I would say, writ large, violence is bad. You can quote me on that. You can stitch that onto a pillow. But the American founders, and to a lesser extent, I would say probably myself, and I'd say a lot of other folks out there, a lot of other Americans out there, if people are deprived of things that will naturally result in a flourishing society, that resulting in violence is kind of a chemical reaction in the American revolutionary process. I don't know that the answer is to want something else instead, or to settle for less. It might sound a little bit grim, and maybe I don't know what I'm talking about because I haven't yet had to put my life on the line for the American dream. But I would say that if it's a question of letting the American dream die ignominiously, or needing to have it be something different because it's just not economically viable anymore, I would rather fight for it than have it just peter out like that. I mean, to an extent, Mark, you kind of admitted this yourself in your opening statement. You said something to the tune of, this isn't something we should dream unless the economic conditions are different. Okay, well, gotcha, I guess, in the sense that that statement entails that if the economic conditions were different, then that dream would still be worthy. And therefore, I would take it a step further and say, if the economic conditions are different, to make that dream more difficult, then if anything, that should spur us on to make the economic conditions easier, whether that be from the podium or in the streets if we have to. And then next, something else that you mentioned, I'm really glad that you brought this up. I think this is a valuable conversation to have. Essentially, this idea that the history of the American dream isn't clean, and that it's been propagandized to an extent in order to achieve certain political goals. And you gave some examples like the Reconstruction South, or the fact that there are these minority groups who are, to an extent, sort of systemically excluded from the American dream, like homosexual couples. They technically can't have children, so where do they fit in? And that's great. I'm really glad that you brought that up. Pertaining to Reconstruction era South, I would say that Black Americans liberated themselves and were able to flourish in American society specifically by enacting the tenets of the American dream as I described. So generally speaking, from a super high level, the broad sort of historical movement of Black Americans as a race/class after the Civil War was, one, they educated themselves. Two, they got wage-paying jobs and suffrage, so they had the right to vote. Three, they started integrating. They started marrying and having kids. They started marrying people who weren't Black and having kids. And we can talk all day about how those things took longer than they should have, or that there were people in the United States who wanted to restrict those things, and that was wrong and that was terrible. But if we're talking about the American dream and how that served or harmed people in Reconstruction, I would put so much more of the blame, if you were to quantify it, on Andrew Johnson or just the post-Civil War Southern social order. I would blame those things far, far more than I would on how the American dream was leveraged or twisted culturally at the time. Because if we're talking about the American dream within the framework that I provided, how we got to the point where you and I and the majority of Americans wouldn't look or think twice at the idea of African Americans being able to marry who they want, vote for who they want, gain well-paying jobs, build wealth. The fact that they are able to do all those things and that it's culturally good and appropriate for them to do that, it was because freed slaves latched onto the American dream and just did not let go. So that's how I would address that argument. And then for things like homosexual couples, people like that can still adopt. And depending on how flexible your stance is on gender ideology, like whether or not men can get pregnant and stuff like that, then there's room for debate there as well. And then the final piece of rebuttal that I'll give, and Mark, I want to give you credit here. I think this is the strongest argument that you have. The idea essentially that the American dream is out of room. That maybe at one point that was a worthy aspiration and that Americans did flourish from desiring and achieving those things. But that the conditions for ownership and industrial growth have fundamentally changed. So perhaps now it's better to respect the American dream for, in the past tense for what it was, and then now look to something else. And if that happened, I hope it doesn't, but if that happened, just generally, if the status quo changed, if the American dream and our understanding of it changed to something else because the current one is quote unquote out of room, then we would still, maybe this is the originalist in me, but I feel like we will have, if that happens, that we will have lost a cherished element of our history and to a degree what makes us American, if that were to happen. And maybe we would still quote unquote be American nominally and still be able to call ourselves American nominally, but there are intangibles there that I'm sure would die through the natural entropy of time, and that we would be less American in a perhaps unalterable way if that were to happen. And I think that's kind of sad. Maybe that's kind of a weak argument. Maybe me just being sad about that is not really an argument, but that's something that's, I think, worthy of consideration, that a society is, in ways that people can and can't see, weaker or less cohesive if we lose understandings of our own history or timeless elements of how we were founded and the aspirations that our founders held when America achieved independence. So with that, I'll conclude my rebuttal. Take it away, Mark.
Yeah, well, there was a lot there. Historically, the term or the phrase "the American Dream" was not used in Reconstruction South. It was not used until I think after World War One, might have been right around World War Two. And so I'm not sure if the argument against the impact that the American dream, at least the propagandizing of it to former slaves, had on their experiences, they were just pursuing a better life. And I think that's the root of the American dream. It's not just, again, as I said in my opening statements, it's not just dreaming of a better life. It's actually pursuing. It's actually achieving a better life. And there was room for bettering oneself. There was room for betterment, for individuals to better themselves, for communities to better themselves, for social interactions to improve, to progress, to allow more minority groups into the wider American umbrella. And my argument when it comes to social change is I don't think there's that much room left where people can actually improve. They might be able to improve their own individual actions, behaviors as an individual, but economically speaking, that no longer has the same, I guess, benefits, the same reward. I mean, you should better yourself even without reward, but in the past, if you better yourself, you became more productive, you became wealthier, you improved your living condition. Nowadays, if you improve yourself, are you really going to get better economically? Or are you still going to have to take out a loan just to have a car? Or take out a loan just to own a home? Or take out a loan to get a decent education that is now required to get a decent job that pays a lower wage than what's required to pay all that off? So, is there really room nowadays for people to not only better themselves when it comes to their own individual behavior, but better their living conditions? And so, yeah, things might have progressed. And I think that the pursuit of the better life, which is the heart of the American dream, at least historically speaking, that's somewhat different from your definition of the American dream, which is the criteria is owning a home, having a family, or being married to have a family, and what was the third thing?
Yeah, the third thing was being financially better off than your parents.
Oh, oh, yeah, that's definitely not happening nowadays. And so at least one of your criteria is most definitely not happening. And then the other two is also not really happening. It might be happening, but much later than our parents and our parents' parents. You know, they were starting families in their 20s. Now people are starting families in their late 30s, going into their 40s, like having kids, much later than before. And it's even worse when it comes to owning a home. So your definition of the American dream, which might be a little bit different from the historic use of bettering one's life, just generally speaking, is it might still be applicable today, which is a point for your argument, but it's for a much older, age bracket. It's not for 20-year-olds nowadays. It's not even for many 30-year-olds. It's for the 40 and 50-year-olds nowadays to just start achieving the American dream. That is financial stability, a home, car, a family, and that's if they even choose to do these things, to have their own home, to have a family. More and more people are not choosing that. And so, with your definition of the American dream, would people who actively choose not to pursue obtaining a family, are they still under the American dream? Because they have the liberty to not have a family. That's their choice. Are they still living under the American dream? And based on your definition, I don't think that they are. You might argue that they still are because they're pursuing their liberty to do that. But I don't think that your definition of the American dream really applies to a large swath and a growing swath of the American populace. That's not what Americans are dreaming for, not what gets them up every day and working. It's not, I mean, for many Americans, it still is, and kudos to them. But for a growing population, it's not the case. And should we still have that social expectation of, oh, if you're not pursuing the American dream, and if you don't obtain the American dream, are you really living as an American? Based on your definition, I don't think that would be the case. And so it's these expectations and the disappointments of not achieving those expectations, whether they be social expectations or my main argument, economic expectations. I don't think having those expectations only to like have a guarantee of disappointment, I don't think that's healthy for our psyche. I think we need to set more realistic goals. I think we need to challenge existing systems when it comes through peaceful means. I know you brought up Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson did not want his own slaves to rebel and kill him, I don't think. So his version of the people fighting for freedom doesn't really apply to everyone. And Thomas Jefferson, he was a radical, especially when he was in France and the French Revolution was going on. But most founders did not think like that at all, not even close. Washington did not think that. John Adams most definitely did not think of like that, where people have to rebel every time they want some change. No, they believed, and they actually did this in the founding generation, was procedural change through legal means, through changing things constitutionally with amendments or with constitutional conventions, which they had a bunch of, not just for the federal convention. I mean, they've only had one for the federal constitution, but they had a bunch for state constitutions. When it comes to creating the state constitutions and then replacing the state constitutions with new constitutions, like within a couple years of each other. So they were constantly changing their legal system, their constitutional system. The social environment was changing, the economic environment was changing, the geopolitical environment was changing. There was a lot of change, a lot of progress, a lot of room for people to dream and achieve their dreams. And that's a necessary component. Change is a necessary component. I should say, peaceful change is a necessary component to the American dream. But we're not changing all that much right now. Legal system is pretty much the same. Our economic system is pretty much the same. And it's at a disadvantage to most Americans, where you have the wealthy who are taking in more wealth, but also committing the most egregious, degenerate crimes imaginable and getting away with it. How is that a fair legal system? How is that a fair economic system? Why do the worst people, socially and behaviorally, why are they in positions of not just political power, but also economic power? Why are they the ones dictating our living conditions, our working conditions, our social interactions? Why are they the ones doing that? And again, I don't want to make this a Huey Long rally, but unless that changes, unless we clean house and have reform when it comes to our economic laws, financial laws, and our political requirements for people to hold office and to get better people in office, I don't think that we should be promoting the American dream as much. And you say this as a counter argument to me, is that I still want the American dream to exist in principle. I do want the American dream to exist in principle. More of the historic definition, which is just bettering one's life rather than the specific criterion. But even your specific criterion are still good to me. And I still want that for most Americans, if not all Americans. But most Americans cannot achieve that. And it's that little difference, that inability to achieve the American dream, is what makes the American dream more dangerous. It's what builds resentment and discontent among the classes. And that discontent might explode, might crescendo into economic change through an economic class warfare revolution, but I don't want that either. I'm more of like the founding generation, where we need to have change, but it needs to be procedural, it needs to be legal, constitutional, it cannot be violent. We cannot have the classes fighting each other, even though one class is oppressing another, at least economically speaking. I don't think that justifies open, real warfare and terrorism. I'm not a socialist anarchist like in the 1910s during World War One, where you had a bunch of that going on, a bunch of bombings of the old Gilded Age class, the political class. Like FDR, he almost died from an anarchist bombing in like 1919 or something like that. So, think about all the good that FDR did when it comes to progressing. He also did some bad, but let's just focus on the good parts of the change that he implemented and how that would not have happened. That legal change, that how we view the Constitution, how we view the federal government, that would not have happened if FDR died because of some anarchist who wanted class warfare now at that time. So I don't propose class warfare. I don't think that would be a good thing. Despite what Thomas Jefferson might have said, and I do believe in the procedural change, and we can have the aspiration as a political movement to enact change, but when it comes to individual behavior, when it comes to individual expectations, I don't think that we should have the American dream still, until we have an environment where people can actually achieve the American dream.
All right, Mark, thank you. And then this brings us to concluding statements. Am I correct in thinking that?
Well, we can have open discussion, like just back and forth. I know we took a while. It's been almost an hour. We just passed the rebuttal part. But yeah, it's just open discussion back and forth based on what we talked about. And then we can do a quick recap after that, and concluding remarks, and then the outro.
Okay, cool. Just so you know, I have about 20 more minutes, but that should be okay. Yeah, so, well, to start, do you have any questions for me?
Yeah, how do you view your criteria for the American dream versus the more historic, at least even before the term was being used,
Yeah.
people were pursuing the betterment of their lives, however that looked, whether that looked like people owning their own homes or starting their own businesses or having their own families, which is definitely a part of it historically. But there's also social changes as well, like when it comes to Jim Crow being able to vote in the South for black people, being able to, interracial marriage, which didn't become legal until like the 60s. So that's 100 years after the Civil War that was the case. But within that 100-year period, you did have people who were pursuing interracial marriage. They were pursuing it, and then they achieved it. And again, it's that pursuit and achievement part that I think is very crucial in the success of the American dream, and why the American dream no longer applies today is because we can no longer achieve things. We might pursue it, we might want things, but if we can't, if the environment is such that we can't actually achieve many aspects of the American dream, then what's the point of having the American dream other than giving us false hope and bad expectations?
Yeah. So, regarding the exact difference, I'll be the first to say that my framework is certainly not perfect or comprehensive. It was mostly for the sake of practicality, but even aside from that, contrasting the more abstract and possibly the more universally understood American dream, just the betterment of one's life more generally, and then the specific things that I listed. Um, for my own understanding of American history, and this might be eisegesis. For those who don't know, eisegesis is essentially you reading your ideas into something as opposed to you trying to draw ideas out of something. Uh, when I look at America's various different broad phases, so the Revolutionary period, colonial period, westward expansion, industrialization, and then our rise in post World War II to being a global superpower. When I look at all of that, especially on our first 150 years or so, throughout that whole time, there have been plenty of people who either didn't want or didn't achieve the American dream, even in the way that I specifically put it. With that said, America taking its place as a regional and then a global contender, and then arguably the most powerful or wealthiest nation in the world, was people being both enterprising economically and desiring a nuclear community, so to speak. But I think we can both agree that the nuclear family is kind of a myth and was very much a post-war thing. I'm more so talking about being able to marry and provide for your family under your own means, as opposed to the wife in the home and the man in a white-collar job. But the aesthetics of the nuclear family when that term first appeared. So everyone from skilled laborers and business owners who had carpentry shops and were tailors and restaurateurs and pioneers who had little gardens and then had to hunt for their meat, and fur trappers and settlers and railroad engineers and doughboys, and then GIs, and then now modern people. America seeing explosive growth, or it being part of the greater geopolitical conversation. I would say we owe a lot of that to the fact that people pursued the specific ends that I laid out at the beginning of the debate. And so a question that I would have for you is something that I wanted to hear a little bit more about it after you mentioned it. We both spoke a lot about the economic viability of the American dream, and how there's this danger of there being a depressive effect for the American dream, essentially, if people can't get it. That there has to be the combination of aspiration and achievement that you mentioned, which I personally agree with. But you were mentioning how the American dream is maybe not worthy or adequate culturally either, and I just wanted to hear you elaborate on that a little bit more because I'm not sure I can fully understand what you meant.
Of the cultural changes?
Yeah, just how uh, it might be just bad for American society beyond the numbers of it, or uh, if the American dream either as you would historically understand it, or as how we've been discussing it for this particular debate, if we're gonna dream something else instead, then what is it? Pretty much.
Well, yeah, so for the cultural aspect, my point was part of the American dream was pursuing a better life.
Mm.
Was that requires change. If there's a life where um, whites and blacks cannot marry, well, then a change in that respect would be whites and blacks able to marry. And so we have a lot of these changes: the expectations of women, the expectations of men, the expectations of husbands, wives, of these social or intimate interactions between people. They've changed, and they've changed a lot. How people dress, what they listen to for music, how they dance, the food that they eat, how they talk, all these things are different. Whether that's better or worse, I don't, that's not part of this discussion, but they're different. And it feels like people are pursuing these changes because it makes them feel better than just doing what was happening in the past. And my point with the cultural changes is all this change actually healthy for us? Like we've allowed same sex marriage now, we've allowed interracial marriage. That's good. Will the next change be good though? And I brought up polygamy, and that's something that I'm hearing concerningly a little bit more on, mostly Mormons, or it's like people on like the far right, the Mormon types want it for their own religious reasons or whatever, and then you have people on the left who believe in polyamorous relationships or whatever. They also want that, um, and I don't really think that polygamy would be a positive change for our country, unlike interracial marriage was, unlike same-sex marriage, which is still debatable. It only happened like a decade ago when it became constitutional right. Um, and so we're still looking at the effects of that becoming a right. But I think it's mostly positive, and but I'm not sure if polygamy would be positive. I'm not sure if other changes will be positive. Other ways that we, dress or listen to music or eat food or all these other changes, which might seem like nothing important, but they're very important when it comes to how we see ourselves, how we interact with each other. And I'm concerned that the American dream, which requires change, the betterment of one's life requires change. If you're already the better person, you don't need to change. You need to become better, which will require change. And does America need a change anymore? There are some changes that I think would be good, like when it comes to limiting the power of the few and reorganizing the ownership of the means of production or something like that. But when it comes to specifically the social interactions that's part of your question, will change that is required for the American dream be healthy? Will any more change be healthy for America? And I'm not sure about that. I mean, there's still Americans who debate whether or not the change that we've had in the past, like same-sex marriage, if that was even good. And so this is still up for debate, and and I'm not sure it's healthy for us to change so much so quickly without knowing the effects on society.
Okay. Um, I am nearly out of time. So, do you want to go into recap and conclusions?
Yeah, we can do that real quick. So today, Evan and I, we debated on whether or not we should still dream the American dream in 2026 and beyond. And for Evan's opening statement, he talked about how the American dream, as he's defining it for the sake of this debate, is threefold or three and a half fold. That being having a home, having a family, a wife and kids, or a spouse and kids, and then also being economically better off than your parents. For my opening statements, I argued that the American dream is not achievable anymore. Those expectations of owning a home, of starting a family, of especially being better off economically or financially than your parents, that I definitely think is way off. The other two things you can still do, but not with economic freedom. You have to go into debt to do those things. And so that was my main argument, which is the economic side and how the having the American dream will only build discontent of the class of Americans who are being propagandized to pursue the American dream without ever being in the environment to achieve the American dream for the vast majority of Americans. Then we went back and forth in an open discussion about what we mean by certain things, like whether or not Evan's definition is a good definition of the American dream relative to its historical use or its application to minority groups who were not promised the American dream. And then Evan asked me about what I meant by social change and how that impacts how that's impacted by the American dream and how that impacts this country. And so, Evan, do you want to include anything in the conclusion and recap?
Yeah. I mean, the only thing that I'll mention to cap it off is I'm still unconvinced that the American dream is impossible in any of its variants, economically speaking. Mark, I think that you're trying to put the American dream in this pseudo doomer lens where it's just where you've basically gone at multiple points. Well, it's just not happening, and I don't hold that against you, and I think it's a good it's a good node to discuss. However, if we're talking about the American dream, I have to derive that from my own experience at least a little bit. And whenever I hear you say it's impossible, all I think to myself is watch me, because I mean, I'm entering my mid-20s and I'm married, and we're not rich, but we have enough left over in the tank to invest, and we're not thinking about kids anytime soon, but we're on schedule to have kids before we get too old. And I know that in the broad strokes that my story is not exceptional among Americans writ large. And I would say that for anyone who is in the position where they are aware of the American dream and they wish to have it, but they're thinking, can it even be done? Then I would say, one, that it can, and two, if you think you can't, then let that turn your focus to why institutionally or who institutionally might be making that more difficult for you, uh, and then vote or protest or unionize or whatever. Do whatever you need to do, non-violently. Let it be known that Evan Lucy does not condone populist violence. But do what you got to do in order to make the American dream a more achievable reality for you. Because if you want it, then you should have it. And I would wish that for everybody. And that's and I guess that's all that I would add, except for just Mark. Thanks as always for making the time for us to have these discussions, and yeah, I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, of course. And this is going to be uploaded and live streamed and uploaded to our YouTube channels. We go under the name Tarpeia for the YouTube channels, and it's the name of our website. I put it on a screen. But our charity is called Amending America, and we are a 501c3 educational nonprofit that focuses on American history and civics. And so we're having these monthly discussions to engage people in historical and civic ideas. And so this month was on the American Dream. Last month was, let's see, it was on voting, or what was last month's?
The last one that we talked about was whether or not one can be proud of being an American while also being honest about our history. I love that debate. That was great.
American pride. Yep. And so the one before was about elderly folk holding office.
The geriocracy, as we both call it.
Yeah, the geriocracy. And so listen to those debates as well, and stay tuned for next month's debate, which we will let you guys know what that's about soon enough. And yeah, thank you, Evan, for your time today, and I hope to see you well next month. All right, bye-bye.